case, it's oftentimes a very poor rendition. Mrs. Patterson typically licenses a copy of the film, but it's as I understand it, it's an aged VHS. How many still remember VHS? Copy of the film that has become quite degraded. And the networks don't mind it. They don't like the high price that her lawyer charges for the use of the film, but they don't mind the kind of campy, scratchy, faded, poor image that kind of gives the Blair Witch effect. But you don't appreciate the quality, and it has led to comments like one of my colleagues made the comment, fellow anthropologist who had done actually some analysis of the film and had published on it, make the comment that there is so little detail in there, it's really worthless, he says. You can't even see facial detail. Well, I beg to differ, and I think I'll show you some examples. There have been some other really nice renditions. I'm going to talk about one that I was involved in the culmination of, but the resulting file's too big to put into a PowerPoint. But this is one from the internet that's done quite nicely. And the film speed is much closer to the appropriate. For so many years, they always played it at 22 frames per second because that was the preferred film frame rate for broadcast filming. Fast enough that you got a nice smooth image. It didn't look like an old-fashioned Keystone Cops movie, with the herky-jerky movements. But the film has been quite conclusively determined was not shot at 22 frames per second. It's somewhere between 16 and 18 frames per second. And there is that potential for variance in the performance of this make and model of camera, even though the snap dial stops at 18 frames per second, not 16. But the analysis of the physics involved suggested it was 16 frames per second. That's absolutely within the limitations of the specs of the camera as published. At that frame speed, I wanted to point out, you get a much better sense of the inertia, the mass of that creature, and that heavy arm swing, very relaxed arm swing as she's striding quite purposefully across that sandbar, retreating rapidly from the approach of Roger and Bob. It's just kind of mesmerizing to watch it like that. All right. Now, for me, this all started back in 1969. I was a youngster attending Indian Trail Elementary. I had the pleasure of meeting up with one of my childhood buddies who was my mother was the den leader for many, many years, and we were in Boy Scouts. It's funny because it wasn't too long ago that one of the group had posted a snapshot of us a few years later when we were in Boy Scouts. And Mike was in this shot, and I was there, and several other people that our paths have crossed now and again in college and subsequently and at various reunions and other occasions. It turns out he was at the showing of the film too. Whether it was the same hour, I'm not sure. There were two or three showings that day. But the kids, I was at school and the kids were all abuzz. We were at a program, but then we were waiting in our room for our chance to go out and do our performance for the parents that evening. And the kids were talking about this film that was coming to town, depicting Bigfoot. And I had never heard of Bigfoot. This was new, completely new to me. But I, at that age, was already extremely interested in all things prehistoric, dinosaurs and cavemen and Ice Age megafauna and all the mysteries, natural history mysteries around the world. And so I was all on the edge of my seat, all ears, listening to this. And so after the program, my parents had already left after our class had performed. And so in the dark, I was running in amongst these gigantic ponderosa pine trees, which you have good examples of around here. And of course, I would just imagine that behind every tree trunk was going to be a Sasquatch. So it was only 2.5 blocks, but it was the longest 2.5 blocks, I think. And raced home, grabbed the paper, opened it up, and here's the advertisement. And subsequently, after describing this experience, someone actually sent me a copy of that advertisement that was in the Spokesman Review, I think it was the title of the paper. So I convinced my dad we had to go to this. So he and I, and along with our my younger brother, went, and we were, well, before I go there, it wasn't too long after this that Harry and the Hendersons came out. I can't remember the year, but when that show came out, my mom was just aghast. She goes, "Jeff, that's you!" Little Ernie Henderson, right down to the cowlick and everything. You know, it was like, it must have been fated. You know, it was in the stars. But I actually found a picture of the Spokane Coliseum in an archival file there, and I don't know if this was the event, but it was just like that. Roger came walking out onto the stage from behind the curtain, from the side of the stage, and my dad and my brother and I were in the center section, third row there, right, just with the screen, this huge, you know, oversized screen behind that curtain, bigger than life, to see this documentary, which showcased that historic 60 seconds of film footage. And so I didn't get the opportunity to meet Roger, but he came out and briefly introduced what we were about to see, and then came out afterwards and fielded a few questions. But then also, upon leaving the Coliseum, we were given a handout of a sample newsletter and an application for membership in the Northwest Research Association. This was Roger's attempt to create an organization that would generate a subscription revenue flow to help underwrite his exploits in the field, his search for this mysterious creature. And membership had some perks, which included a 11 by 14 black and white print. And now remember, these prints are from the original film, the original imagery there. A 5 by 7 color, I keep doing that, sorry. 5 by 7 color print, a close-up of Patty. And then, of course, you could purchase his book. And also, members could buy replica footprint casts, which included this 1963 track that Roger cast on Bluff Creek near the film site, but not at the film site, but 4 years earlier. This isn't Patty. This represents a big 16 to 17 inch, well, 16 inch footprint, which is much broader than Patty's footprint. I think it represents the big male that was in that area. And his tracks were found. This is, in fact, is the same footprint, or the footprint of the same individual who left tracks that were documented by Jerry Crew in 1958. So his tracks were popping up off and on under various circumstances and discovered by various witnesses over a couple of decades during that time period. So it's interesting because in all my talking about this, anyone in this room who was a member of the Northwest Research Association? Yeah, that's been the story. Roger passed away from leukemia just a couple of years later. I don't think the organization really ever got off the ground. I don't remember getting more than one or maybe two newsletters. But in all my talking, I've only met indirectly. Actually, was at a yard sale, purchasing someone else had purchased it and they gave it to me. It was an old briefcase, and in the briefcase was a replica of Patty's footprint and a couple of snapshots of Roger, that just promo pictures of Roger, like the ones you saw, and a certificate for membership of this individual whose estate sale liquidated his Sasquatch holdings, a membership certificate to the Northwest Research Association. So, and in all my travels, I'm the only one that I know of who has one of these casts. So the replicas, those of you who got that replica, it traces back to apparently a singular example. No one else has stepped forward and said, "Oh, I have one of those." It was made with a very an acrylic material, and it's a very nice replica of a cast that Roger made, which is featured prominently if you're interested in his book. All right, well, moving along, we'll come back. The significance of that picture, though, I want to emphasize later on. Of course, I had just a very brief, indirect introduction to Roger, but I've had the good fortune of spending considerable time with Bob Gimlin. And I'm sure a number of you in the room have as well, and you'll agree with me that you can't spend 5 minutes with this guy and not be absolutely confident that he's the salt of the earth. He's just the straightest arrow that there's ever been, and just a really nice guy. Actually my fondest memories, besides hearing him tell his story, meeting him for the first time, was we both spoke at a program. It was called Sasquatch, the sightings, or the stories, the sightings, and the science. And they had a native storyteller representing the stories. They had Bob representing the sighting, and then they had me representing the science. And he and I were staying together in a hotel, and so for a couple days took our meals together and so forth. And we didn't talk about Sasquatch at all. We talked about our family and our kids and jobs we've had and where we've lived and yada yada yada. Just the common things you talk about. It was just the most down to earth guy. He wasn't bending my arm. You gotta believe. Nothing like that. It was just very down to earth. So that speaks, I think, volumes for the credibility when you compare his character to that of others who have made disclaimers and prejudicial comments. So, all right. So here is a high-resolution scan of that 5x7 color print, photographic print, that was obviously made from the original master film. Now, you look at that and you tell me, oh, I can't see any facial details. And I'll say, you need to go have your eyes examined. I mean, you can see the heavy brow ridge, the sloping forehead. You can see the light shining off the nose, the shadow beneath a hooded nose, either with slightly forward-directed nostrils or slightly downward. We can't really quite resolve that. There's a pouting of the upper lip. It's like if you've ever seen a chimpanzee do this compressed lip display, when they're real tense, they'll press their lip in the top when they have a very muscular mouth, the orbicularis is well developed, and they'll pooch out, puff out. There you can see it. You can see the chinless lower jaw, the flaring gonial angle, the shadow of the very thick masseter muscle. You can see the high, wide cheekbones that are catching the light there. For someone to say, oh, look, you can see it's a mask and the eye is cut out so you can see out of it. That's the glint of the sun off the hairless skin over the nose and the upper part of the cheek below the eye. It's just, there's lots and lots of anatomy there to be seen. Okay, we'll come back to more of that later. I wondered, for a long time I wondered, if they had made those prints from the original film, why would you stop with just one frame? Why wouldn't you make more? Well, it turns out that they did. And they did make a brief appearance, if you're familiar with the Argosy magazine article or the National Wildlife. Yell at me if I keep standing right in front of me, you can't see that. The National Wildlife magazine article had these in very small scale and not very useful or informative. But copies of these languished in a safe apparently for years and years, and eventually came to light. And Chris Murphy did a lot to promote them. They first were published in the book Man Like Monsters on Trial, which was an edited volume of some of the papers presented at a conference on Bigfoot at the University of British Columbia, one of the first serious academic conferences on this topic. But there was politics, but we won't get into that. And subsequently, Chris Murphy again did some more work on these images. But here they are. Here are the high-resolution files, high-definition files that he has shared with me, and you can see all sorts of things. I mean, at this point, this is very early, at the beginning of the encounter, when Roger had his horse had fallen on its side. He extricated his camera as expeditiously as he could, ran across the creek bed, yelling to Bob to cover it. Bob rode across the creek on his horseback, pulled his .30-06 from his scabbard, and dismounted, clutching tenaciously to the reins. He said he didn't want that horse to get away because the pack horse had already pulled loose from him and run and bolted downstream. And so initially she was just on the other side of the creek. In fact, you can see her tracks going up the sandbar onto the edge of the creek, probably just before they got there. And then she began to stride, like I said, very purposefully away from them. But you notice, look at this intermediate but relatively high compared to a human attachment of the trapezius muscle. It's broad shoulders. You can actually see as she's moving, you'll watch for the shoulder blade slide under the skin there. You can see the massive erector spinae muscles, these two columns right here. And they come down and they end right at the edge of the iliac crest, the pelvic bone. You can see well-defined buttocks, the gluteus maximus. And you can see the navel cleft, which I'll attention to that a little more detail later on. Look at the size of those hands. I mean, they're big baseball mitts, long arms from the shoulder down. You can see why some people say, even though later in some of the shots they don't look like they're that long, but you can see if someone had just glimpsed her from this perspective for a brief time, they'd say her hands almost came down to her knees because she's so crouched, the supporting limb is very bent, and this limb is flexed and raised to clear that foot because of the flexed nature of her other limb. And so the hands are quite low. You can see the plantar surface of the foot quite well. In fact, so well, on enlargement, you can actually see the individual toe pads quite clearly. There's no question that foot, whatever it is at this point, we'll just offer that caveat, whatever it is responsible for the tracks that were cast subsequently at the spot on that day by Rodney Patterson. Here's another one. Now the other foot. Now this one shows a problem that has tripped up people. And that is that the foot now is elevated to a point that the orientation of the sole of the foot is catching the afternoon sun, and it's bouncing it back to the camera lens and overexposing that flat, hairless surface, that kind of smooth surface. And when it's overexposed, it gains a halo. It has a fuzzy edge. It's not nice and crisp. And so it gives a very false image, or impression rather, a false impression of the actual proportions of the foot.